Good day and welcome to the 69th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. I'll continue with the sub-series on philosophy um, and how to understand Western philosophy and the alternatives from the Global South. And today I'm going to talk about DTM and logic. Now, what is logic? If you Google or you do ChatGTP, you get a Eurocentric definition of logic. For example, ChatGPT says logic is the study and application of reasoning. It provides a systematic framework to evaluate whether arguments are valid or invalid and whether statements are true or false based on a set of rules or principles. Now, you may think this is a general definition, but as I will show, there are other logical systems than the one they uh, perceive here as a system that produces only two values, true or false. So that's why I have a DTM definition of logic that said that logic is a set of rules for reasoning, for building a storyline and arguing a proposition. Logic determines the validity of an argument, and the validity could be much more than true and false. And the reasoning has a purpose, that is, building a storyline and arguing a proposition implicitly or explicitly. So if I look at the differences between DTM and Eurocentrism on logic, I see four differences. One is that Eurocentrism acknowledges only one system of logic as valid. That's the let's say, what Europe has produced in logic, while DTM acknowledges that there are different systems of logics that is valid. So there's not one system of logic. Eurocentrism regards European logic as universal, while DTM regards European logic as a particular form of logic and not a universal one. Eurocentrism has one outcome of logic, true or false, while DTM has multiple outcomes of logic. I'll explain the Jainism logic from the Indian Jain philosophy that has 7 outcomes. And Eurocentrism removes ethics from logic, while DTM includes ethics in logic. And it is in line with the general philosophy in Eurocentrism, where ethics is removed from knowledge and from philosophy, from knowledge itself. Now, these rules of reasoning that ChatGPT was talking about was laid down more than 2 centuries ago, 2.5 centuries ago, by Greek philosopher Aristotle, and he defined 3 laws in logic. The law of identity, meaning A equals A. A thing is always equals to or identical to itself. So you say Columbus is Columbus. Well, common sense, right? At first glance, yes. But if you go deeper, it doesn't hold. Then the law of non-contradiction, which is a reverse way of saying the law of identity. The law of non-contradiction is that A is not non-A. A thing cannot be different from itself. It is a different way of formulating the first law. When we say Columbus is not a dog, Columbus is Columbus. And then the third law is the law of the excluded middle. If A equals A, it cannot equal non-A. Everything is and must be either one of the two mutual exclusive things. So a thing cannot be Columbus and a dog. It's either Columbus or a dog. So these are interconnected rules. And this is how the basis for Eurocentric logic was founded. Now let's look at a critique that is possible. One is, a DTM critique is that the Aristotelian logic, Eurocentric logic, has a limited application. This holds only in situation of stability. I'll show that later when I go into problems of transition. Then logic can be limited by the languages used. So the English language can limit you in your thinking in terms of logic. I'll go into that also. And the third critique is that the logic assumes that reasoning is objective and devoid from ethical consideration. So, I'll come back to that in when you talk about Columbus, and how you could put up reasoning in such a way that it turns out, that the reality can be judged objectively. So you could say Columbus is a hero, and then if you say Columbus is a hero, and then you build a reasoning behind it. Why is he a hero? Because he discovered the Americas. And why did he discover the Americas? Because he was a scientist, a discoverer, somebody looking for something new. Well, this seems to be a logical reasoning. But for the people of Abya, you see already in the language of the terminology, Latin America for the Eurocentrists, Abya for the indigenous people. So for the indigenous people of Abya, he was not a discoverer, nor a scientist. He was a criminal. So there comes an ethical judgment, which is different from the ethical judgment in the storyline with the logic that builds up a narrative of Eurocentrism. Now, let me go into the question of the application of Aristotelian logic. So if you have a stability, you are alive, you wake up, you do your work, you go to bed, then you could say Columbus, you, me, is alive. Law of identity, if you say Columbus is Columbus, the person who is alive, fine. But now suppose you have a phase in life where you are dying. You're not dead, you are dying. You are transitioning from life to death. Now, if the transition is abrupt, for example, you take the criterion of heartbeats, the heart stops beating, then according to that criterion, the person is dead. But, and that could be, abrupt. But if it's not abrupt, and you have different criteria of life and death, for death, heartbeat, brain activity, then the heart can stop beating while the brain is still active. And when CPR is asserted, you exercise CPR, get the heartbeat back, then the question comes, in that transitional period in which your heart stopped beating, were you dead or alive? Now, Aristotelian logic cannot answer this. You're either dead or alive. But other forms of logic can do that. They can say you can be both dead and alive according to the criteria you use. So it's not universal. In the application of transition, you can have a situation where you are dead and alive. Dead according to one criterion, alive according to the other criterion. And the test is that when the CPR brings you back, then according to the criterion of heartbeat, you are dead, and now you're alive, but you can die, but you can't come from death to alive. It doesn't go, with logic, but with Aristotelian logic. But other forms of logic, which acknowledges transition as part of reality, They would say in that period of transition, yes, you could be both. You could be dead and alive. You could have characteristic of the one phase of the transition and the other phase of the transition in that transitional period. So the application of Aristotelian logic is limited. It's only when you have stability. Take the question of logic and language. I found an interesting case described by Victor Okaya about the Acholi people from southern Sudan. And he studied philosophy, and he says that in their language, they have another view of the principle of the excluded middle. Okaya says this principle says that between a statement and its negation, there's no alternative. Actually, language, I hope I pronounce it right, however, has a peculiar way of repeating an adjective in a manner that seems to suggest a third possible alternative between a statement and its negation. For example, Pini liet, I hope I do pronounce it right. Pini liet, it is hot. Pini pe liet, it is not hot. Pini liet let, it is rather hot. And in English, rather doesn't capture, he says, the actual idea of liatlet, which is something between 1 and 2. Pini liatlet quite unambiguously assert that it is either hot nor not hot, and the law of excluded middle rules out just this possibility. This evidence against the law of the excluded middle from an actually standpoint. So you see, language, some languages are limited in how logic can be understood. In this case, this African language has a better understanding of logic because it enables things to be both, let's say, one side and its negation, while the excluded middle says you can be either one or the other. Now, why is logic so important in reasoning? Let's say that we try to make sense of the current world politics with Aristotelian logic, which of the basis is the law of identity. Then you would say the world as we know it will always exist. Basically, that's the argument of Fukuyama when he says we are at the end of history, which is such a nonsense, but just common sense tells you, how can you think that after 700 years of evidence of history that shows that history is change and change and change, you come up with a conclusion that no, there's no change anymore. History will be like this. United States will be the most powerful country in the coming 70,000 years. It is just nonsense. But using Aristotelian logic, he just affirms this statement. We're at the end of history. But if you use DTM logic, you say world history is a history of changes and transitions. So the question is, where are we now in the transition from where do we come and where do we go? So, and in DTM we argue world history stands at a place now where it comes from colonialism and is going to a multipolar and pluriversal world. So we are looking at the factors that are driving the transition and how will the world look like after the transition. So we look at Ukraine, Palestine, BRICS, and see them as driving forces towards a new world system. When you're in the midst of the crisis in Ukraine, Palestine now, you might not see it. You see the bombing and the killing of all these people, and you think, this is how it will be forever. Israel, the West, the US will have the power for the next 70,000 years, as Fukuyama is saying. But with DTM, you're saying, no, these are expressions of the transition in which we are now. And look at world history, you see that humanity strives to build societies with social justice in different ways: economic social justice, political social justice in terms of freedom of communities, of people. So you study the current world events from the perspective that we are in a transitional phase, because we study the history of humankind, and we see that the last 500 years in which we've lived is a particular civilization which is coming to its end. And that is the kind of study that is only possible when you use DTM logic and not Aristotelian logic. Take another thing. If you look at the world and you ask yourself, is China a socialist or capitalist country? Is Venezuela a socialist or a capitalist country? Then often people who pose this question think that there are only two identities possible. You're either socialist or capitalist. And then the criteria could be, if you are a Marxist, you say the criteria is whether the economy is governed by planned economy, nationalization of the means of production, if that's your criterion. But if you use social justice as a criterion, then China would say, look, we have a system, we call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Venezuela would say, we have a system, we call it the Bolivarian revolution. So their language they use is not limited to only those two terms, socialist or capitalist. They have different concepts and language and terms to say what we have is a system that is not fitting in one of those two, only socialist in the classical sense or capitalist in the classical sense. No, we could have socialism with Chinese characteristics, we could have Bolivarian socialism, which is different. And if you use Aristotelian logic, you get messed up. You can't answer these questions because you only end up in yes or no rather than, oh, there are other possibilities out there. Now, I refer to Aristotelian logic as Eurocentric logic, but within Europe, there has been a school, a philosophical school, led by George Hegel, a German philosopher, 19th century. And he came up with dialectics, the concept where you have a logic that does apply to transition and continuity and change are related to another. And Friedrich Engels elaborated this law of dialectics based on Hegel, and that became the dialectics of Marxism. And he mentions basically 5 laws of dialectics: the transformation from quantity into quality, the change from possibility into inevitability, evolution through contradictions, the conflict between form and content, the negation of the negation. Interesting analysis by Engels. So, the transformation from quantity into quality, an example is the transformation from water into steam by adding quantities of energy. You heat water, the quality of the water is a liquid, but when you add energy, you keep heating it on, and then the liquid transforms into gas. So the quantity of energy transforms the substance into a different quality, from liquid to gas. If you apply this, let's say, in armed protests, one person who protests against the government with a gun is an individual protester. But if millions of people protest with guns, it's a revolution. The quality of the protest changes from a single protest into a revolution due to adding armed people to this body of resistance, and then other things are possible, which is the change of the structure of society. Then the change of possibility into inevitability. So what seems only a possibility, revolution with one armed person, it was possible, becomes inevitable when you have a million of armed people. Now, take Israel. Will Israel exist forever? Before October 7, you might think, yes, they might exist forever. But if you analyze the resistance over the past years and then October 7 has made it clear, then the existence of Israel is not guaranteed anymore. We don't know how many years it will be, but you could see the whole stature and image of Israel has changed dramatically in the past 2 years, from the victims of the Holocaust to the perpetrators of a new Holocaust. So the possibility that Israel might not exist might now become an inevitability. Then evolution through contradictions. Every Marxist is learning this. It is in the Skader school. The contradiction between here and there is solved by motion. How do you come from here to there? Because you move. So a feudal society has two opposite classes, the serfs and the nobility. The social struggle between these classes leads to the rise of new opposing classes, proletariat and bourgeoisie. And class struggle is the driving force behind social evolutions. So the conflict between serf and nobility gives rise to a new contradiction, which is proletariat and bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie then takes over the land, displaces people, and make them owners of only their labor power, not of land anymore. So social evolution moves through this contradiction. And then a conflict between form and content. The photograph is a good example. Columbus at the age of 10 is the same person at the age of 50 in the terms of what makes him that particular individual, his content, which might be his origin, parents, family, his physical outlook in general, shape of his face, color of his skin, his character. All these things define Columbus as a person. But his appearance, the form, at the age of 10 is different from his appearance at the age of 15. The conflict between form and content is resolved through growth and aging. The old form makes way for a new form. Your body grows, it has the same physical characteristics, but it's getting older. The content is the same, it's still Columbus, but the form is changing by aging. So if you analyze social process, that's where you look. What is the content of the current political system? How do you define it, and what are their forms? And you could see colonial domination is a content, and it could have different forms. Settler colonialism, where a small minority from England governs India, have different forms. Eradication of population, like in the Caribbean, get still colonialism, but in a different form. And then the concept of the negation of negation. A negation is the opposite of a state of being. And Engels gave this example, interesting example, which is the metamorphosis of a butterfly. The transformation from an egg to a butterfly has 4 stages. It starts with an egg, it becomes a larva, so the egg must be transformed into an opposite, a larva. The larva is the negation of the egg. It's not the egg anymore. It's a non-egg. It's a not egg. So it has done away with the egg, and it has negated the egg. Now the butterfly keeps evolving to the third stage. It becomes a pupa, a kind of caterpillar. And the final stage is the adult butterfly with wings to fly in the air. The larva is the negation of the egg. The pupa is the negation of the larva. The butterfly is the negation of the pupa. In order to understand evolution, you need to understand that it moves through the negation of the negation, and each stage is on a higher level than the previous one. Now, this was an important contribution that Hegelian dialectics make to philosophy. But the critique is that it doesn't take uncertainty into account. And that is what Indian Jain logics does, exactly that. And uncertainty is contained in its seventh value logic. So the philosophy of Jainism has a logical system with seven values for the outcome. One, something is possible, something is true. For example, Columbus is dead. Something is possible. No, I'm saying possibly, probably, maybe something is true. So the uncertainty is in every part of the statement. Columbus is dead. There's an uncertainty, but we say Columbus is dead, Columbus is not dead, something is false. Columbus is true or dead, Columbus is dying, dead and not dead, uncertainty is there. Something is unassertable. We can't assert whether Columbus is dead or not. We are not in the position to verify it. So an outcome of a research is also that we don't know, we can't assert. Something is true, it might be that he dead, but we can't assert it. Something is false and unassertable, he might not be dead, but we can't assert it. And something is true and false and unassertable. Columbus is dying, we can't assert that. Now, where is the application of Jain logic in life? You see it in many parts, but you need to recognize this. I'll give you two examples in physics, especially in nuclear physics, the field of physics that studies atomic nuclei and their constituents and interaction. So nuclear physics is a very strange world. Once you go there, you see a lot of things that Aristotelian logic just cannot explain. So one of these things, there are many of them, time, energy, matter, waves, there are many things out there in nuclear physics and also in astrophysics, the physics of, astronomy. So the German physicist Werner Heisenberg discovered in 1927 that the more precise the position of a particle, let's say an atom or electron, the more precisely the position of some particle is determined, the less precisely its momentum can be known and vice versa. What is momentum? The momentum is a product of mass and velocity. So let's say kilograms per meters per second. So he says you either know the position or you know the momentum, but you can't know both variables at the same time. This is called the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg. Now, to understand this with Jain logic, you would say, yes, that's possible, yes. But with Aristotelian logic, it's just impossible. How can you not know this? Because, as Heisenberg shows, is that the observation is done with an instrument which is light. And the instrument observation changes either the position or the momentum. So you don't have to understand maybe the technicalities about the things, but Heisenberg has proved it, that you can know either the one or the other, but you can't know both. And for people trained in Aristotelian logic, this doesn't make sense. But with Jain logic, you could say, yes, that could be perfectly possible. Another application in physics is this thing called the thought experiment of Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, the Schrödinger cat. He says, he put a thought experiment. He says, put a cat in a closed steel chamber, wherein the cat's life or death depended on the state of a radioactive atom, whether it had decayed and emitted radiation or not. And according to Schrödinger, the Copenhagen interpretation implies that the cat remains both alive and dead until the state has been observed. And the Copenhagen interpretation emphasizes that quantum mechanics is by its nature probabilistic, meaning not completely certain, and like in the Heisenberg experiments, that measurement can determine the outcome. So this is important. This principle is used in a new technological development of quantum mechanics and quantum computers, and where they use this term, they call it quantum superposition, which means that in the old computers you have either a 0 or a 1. You turn something on or off. With quantum superposition, it turns out that you can have a situation of 0 and 1, and also of 0 and 1, not or, and then you could develop computer systems based on this principle that is much faster. With AI in the coming years, quantum computers will play an important role. But if you use Aristotelian logic, this doesn't make sense at all. You can't understand it. With Jain logic, uncertainty is just part of reality. I'll give you another example of how other systems of logic produce better results. Let's discuss Aristotle's case of syllogism. A syllogism is Greek for conclusion, is a logical rule that consists of three parts: a general proposition, a specific proposition that is linked to the general proposition, and a conclusion that follows from the proposition. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. This is a logical system. So, this is the rule of logic based on the rules of Aristotle. What's the critique of Aristotle's syllogism? One, it has no universal validity because the conclusion logically flows from the first and second proposition. So the validity of the conclusion depends on the validity of the proposition. For example, all white men are devil, Columbus is a white man, so Columbus is a devil. That is logically, according to Aristotle's syllogism, is a correct way of reasoning. But it depends on the first proposition, all men are devils. If that's not the case, then, the argument doesn't hold. Now, if you go to Chinese philosophy, there's a school called Mohism that looked into syllogism, and that says it's not the structure that determines its validity, but the context of the proposition. And then they define three contexts. What is shared between proposition? Black horses are horses, riding black horses is riding horses. What is shared by both proposition is the characteristic of riding. In both proposition, riding is a shared property of both black horses and riding horses. Therefore, you could use the property of riding to connect 1 and 2. So the conclusion is valid. Now, you could have other context, what is distinct between propositions. A carriage is wood, riding a carriage is not riding wood. In this case, riding is not a shared property of carriage and wood. It distinguishes the carriage from the wood. Therefore, you can not use the property of riding to connect 1 and 2, because the riding is not a shared property of wood and carriage. So the conclusion is invalid. And the third context is what is both common and distinct. For example, when a horse is required, you want a horse. A yellow horse or a black one might be brought forward. The color is distinct but not required. The required property is that of a horse, and that is common in both a black and a yellow horse. But when one requires a white horse, a yellow or black horse can't be brought forward because color is now distinct and required. The common property of a horse is not sufficient for the requirement. Now, what do I want to show with these two examples? That there are other logical systems developed outside of Europe, that in India and China, which are better and more suitable to study reality than the Eurocentric Aristotelian logic. So, if you study logic and you are only limited to Aristotle, you just limit your whole argument, your philosophical outlook, the structure of your reasoning. And that's why when we call for DTM to reconstruct the disciplines and reconstruct philosophy and bring in the knowledge of other civilizations, these examples are there to show that it is possible and lead to a better quality of science. So the next episode, I will go deeper into philosophy, but with a modern touch. I'll go into artificial intelligence and DTM. I'll discuss that, but then I will be off in the new year to attend the inauguration of President Maduro in Venezuela. And I'll be traveling, so next episode will be Monday, January the 20th, when I will discuss artificial intelligence and DTM. Meanwhile, I hope the coming year will be better than the past few years, and that Palestine hopefully will be free, if not coming year, soon in the years to come. Thank you.